The Supreme Court deciding to simply leave and not mess with some pretty tough sanctions issued against lawyers for Trump, a group of lawyers who faced the sanctions over their lies and baseless claims about Trump losing the election and lying about that fact. And one of those lawyers has even bigger problems, Sidney Powell, the face of Trump's coup efforts during the November 2020 press conferences with Giuliani. She pled out already. So beyond those sanctions in court, she also pled guilty in that Georgia RICO case. She is Trump's co-defendant there. Now, Trump's lawyers and former lawyers are facing all kinds of heat over all kinds of plots. Now, some of this takes a long time. Our legal experts and reporters have emphasized that in the coverage. And it's not supposed to be fast because people are afforded rights and review. And some of this stuff is fairly unprecedented. But there's new heat this weekend over the fraudulent electors plot. One Wisconsin elector telling 60 Minutes that ultimately whatever they were going to do to lie about and cheat about the campaign was the product of getting tricked by the Trump campaign.
We were tricked. The January 6th committee saw it. Jack Smith, specifically in his indictment, refers to some of the electors were tricked. That was us.
How do you feel about that now?
I mean, terrible.
You know, one answer to that is like, whatever. This is their defense. And instead of saying we did it, we were all about it, they're saying we were tricked, it's somebody else's fault. Another part of this is that's part of the theory of the case. In other words, even if some of these people weren't 100% tricked and they just thought they could get away with it, thought maybe they would get Trump back into office. That's what we've seen in other societies where coups are rewarded if they work. Well, on the flip side, there's a lot of evidence that the prosecutors want to use to show that this did start at the top, not in the middle or the bottom. And then you have Trump's legal calendar. He's paying up hundreds of millions of dollars from that fraud suit I mentioned. He's got the first criminal trial set for New York, March 25th. That's over the 2016 hush money issues. And then the open question we're waiting on any day, could be tomorrow, could be later this week, could be next week. Will the Supreme Court fast track what you see in red there, the appealed Jack Smith coup trial? Well, we're tracking all of this, and I want to bring in New York Times Magazine legal correspondent Emily Bazelon. Welcome.
Thanks so much.
We were just talking in the commercial break before live TV about what I want to ask you about now, which is we'll put the calendar back up. If the Supreme Court does not fast track the coup trial, which is currently on appeal, then the arguably smallest case, the Green hush money trial, goes first. If the Supreme Court greenlights the coup trial that's currently on appeal, if they say we don't need to slow it down, we don't need to review it, the New York DA has already said he would fall back and the coup trial could go first. How much does it matter what goes first when we're talking about the first ever trials of a former president?
I think it matters a lot. I mean, the trial about January 6th is about an issue that is of clear, huge national significance. The New York trial is a smaller matter. It's about hush money payments. Yes, it's an allegation, a set of charges about interfering with the election, but it's based on a more novel legal theory to get it up from a misdemeanor to a felony.
Right.
And I think especially when you think about the public perception of what's really at stake, you don't have to explain to people that a former president not respecting election results is a big deal. You can argue about whether that's what happened or not, but it is a big deal inherently. And I think that there's a much harder argument to make about the hush money payments rising to the same level of significance.
Yeah, and you're speaking to something the prosecutors deal with, which is you have all these crimes you could prosecute, but you exercise judgment on what you do. So a larger, more important case might be a priority over the unimportant case. It almost sounds obvious when I say it that way, but that's how it works, because they don't go after everyone. And here, I know you always like to think, we can put the arrows back up. I know you always think of trials in terms of prominent rappers. And the Green hush money trial is fundamentally misdemeanor Elliott. I mean, it is a misdemeanor that they are converting to make it more serious. And the coup trial and appeal above it is more like, I know who you're thinking of, J.O. felony. It's an actual set of election felonies. And by the way, as I always say, if Trump's innocent or acquitted, fine. But if that were proven against any official, that would be a big deal. And you know that while the right is selective, you know they think it's a big deal because all they're ever criticizing is alleged election interference, talking about alleged election integrity and all these other things. Because what does that mean? At the core is it would be bad to mess with elections.
Exactly. And so I think that's the reason why the order of the trials actually matters a great deal. And as you started by saying, some of this depends on the timing of the Supreme Court. We've already been waiting for the Supreme Court to decide whether to take this case at all. And if it does decide to hear Trump's appeal, what kind of calendar to put that appeal on. And those are really crucial questions because the clock is ticking and delay is a huge aid to former President Trump, no matter what the results are.
Yeah. Well, I got one more case for you, which is the fraud case. Everything's going so fast. It's like that was Friday. But we did a breakdown looking at the fraud cost along with all the other costs. And we'll put that up here because it's actually quite striking. The fraud loss there is $355 million. With the interest on top of that, other penalties, legal fees, and the 2 defamation cases, which you've covered for us here on this very program, altogether $600 million and counting for someone who, according to the state of New York, has roughly 2B. So that's approaching there a quarter of the net worth and counting.
Right. I mean, this is an enormous amount of cash to have on hand. Trump is going to have to either secure a bond, put up this money somehow or other during the appeal. He doesn't get to just not pay it. That's not an option. So I think we're going to see, you know, how much money he comes up with himself, from what sources, whether he tries to use, you know, campaign money for these kinds of expenses, the way he's been doing for his legal bills. It'd be hard to justify, I think, legally, but then you look at enforcement questions. So it's really interesting.
I'll show enforcement. This is new. Letitia James saying this is new today. She will seize the Trump property as you would with any other losing defendant if they don't pay. Quote, if he doesn't have the funds to pay off the judgment, we'll seek judgment enforcement mechanisms. We will ask the judge to seize his assets. That's how it works. It seems like she's not playing around.
Oh, I think that's right. I mean, I think Trump can do things to prevent that from happening. And presumably he's not going to want that kind of embarrassment of having his assets seized. But who knows? Because he also really likes to make this into a big fight, especially with Letitia James, right? And so it's possible he could say, come after me. I mean, this is an order of magnitude that's so great in terms of the money involved. It really changes the stakes.
How the United States should confront Vladimir Putin, who oversaw the long-running imprisonment and in-custody death of his most prominent domestic rival, opposition leader Alexei Navalny. The U.S. has been funding the Ukrainian opposition to Putin's long-running invasion. House Republicans are trying to either limit or stop more aid. Then there's prominent MAGA figures like Tucker Carlson who are openly touting Putin's Russia. So the serious questions, how do you confront a nuclear-armed autocratic dictator on offense, are also mixed with what I can only call some pretty absurd ones. Like, how should we as a society and American polls counter Tucker Carlson doing what you see on your screen, if you haven't watched it yourself, which is this total propaganda where he praises not only the Putin system, but the economic system that Putin and the Kremlin oversee. Now, that's one question. President Biden has been quite clear on all of this on foreign policy, confronting Putin with tough new sanctions here over Navalny's death and vowing to continue to back Ukraine without putting American boots on the ground. Tucker just put out a new statement criticizing Russia for Navalny's death. I want to mention that because it's a bit of a turn from everything he said and did on his recent trip to visit Putin in Russia. Now, his statement came shortly after the release of this Putin interview and what can only be described at times as an oddly promotional trip. All of this drawing a biting new roast from Jon Stewart in just his second episode since returning to The Daily Show last night.
Where do I go to study the particulars of unquestioning propaganda? I would need mentorship.
We're in Moscow tonight. We're here to interview the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin.
Saints be praised. Tell me, Tucker, does this masterclass include field trips?
This is the grocery cart escalator. This is designed, I'm figuring this out now, where the wheels don't move, they lock on the grocery cart escalator. Look, Ma, no hands.
It went on like that. Now, as for the interview, there can be value, factual, journalistic, and otherwise, to questioning all kinds of people, including people with power. In this instance, Carlson did not question Putin very sharply or fact-check him very much. At times, Carlson even echoed some of the blatant lies and propaganda coming from Putin, a former KGB officer. One example I'm about to show you with comedy afterward, if you want to find a laugh amidst the horror. Tucker Carlson wrongly saying out loud, of course, when Putin lies about a pretty well-known fact, the fact that Germany started World War II.
What if Putin starts saying like World War II was Poland's fault because they forced Hitler to invade them? I mean, what do you do with something like that? That's going to be hard.
After World War I, this territory was transferred to Poland, and instead of Danzig, a city of Dansk emerged. Hitler asked them to give it amicably, but they refused.
Of course. Even Jon Stewart didn't have much else to say after that, neither do I. It is just telling. Now then, Jon Stewart's longtime colleague, John Oliver, got in on all of this, mocking and roasting Tucker about how even Putin criticized Tucker over their interview afterwards.
Tucker was so docile, even Putin later made fun of him.
I honestly thought he'd be aggressive, asking these so-called sharp questions. I wasn't simply ready for it, I wanted it. Frankly speaking, I didn't get complete pleasure from this interview.
Wow! There's embarrassing, and there's getting roasted by Putin for being a lapdog embarrassing.
That's how Putin played Tucker. Putin is good at this, and he's good at rhetoric. And again, I'm not showing you any Putin clips for their veracity. It may be that no matter what an interviewer does, Putin, who's overseeing this dictatorship, who's currently holding an American reporter hostage, which they did discuss in that interview, he might criticize anyone for his own ends. But it does show that Tucker's effort to promote Putin and the whole system is obviously not even being returned in short order. So that's all of that. Then there's the actual United States Congress, where there is some bipartisanship, I want to note, on backing Ukraine in the Senate. If you're trying to tell a story in your mind where all the all the Republicans in Congress are just against this and they're falling in line with Tucker, that's actually not the case. There was a bipartisan agreement to try to continue to fund and support Ukraine. If you agree with that policy, you agree with the people in both parties in the Senate pushing it. But over in the House, where there is a more extreme MAGA flank, the Republicans there are trying to block any vote on that bipartisan package as Trump and Tucker bend to Putin in the background. Joan is with us as promised, and we are joined by Che Komanduri, who has worked on several Democratic campaigns, including the Obama campaign. Welcome to both of you. Welcome back, Joan. Che, as I said, some of it is absurdist, but that absurdity is part of the political dynamics. What do you see there, and do you think Tucker was filleted, roasted, and toasted?
Oh, he certainly was. I mean, it reminds me, there's a very famous line in The Office where Michael Scott says, I want people to suck up. I don't want people to suck up to me because they want to advance their career. I want them to suck up to me because they genuinely love me. And I think the reality is that a guy like Vladimir Putin knows the difference. He knows that Tucker is merely an opportunist, and opportunists, like dictators know, can't really be trusted because they will simply not be loyal to the dictator and to the regime. And that is a problem I think that the Republicans really have. They are all a bunch of opportunists. And you can see this in the GOP primary, where people like DeSantis and Christie, who were formerly Trump suck-ups, did not do well because they couldn't explain why they sucked up to this guy and why they are no longer doing so.
It's actually a great point, and you're taking it to some of the theatrics of our current MAGA politics. Joan, here we are at the table. I promised you your turn at this. It seemed like a rough run for Tucker there.
It's a rough run for Tucker. I promised you that I would engage in some Schadenfreude.
Tucker-Freud, sure.
Tucker-Freud. But it was almost sad to watch. I mean, he's been completely neutered. I mean, pushing that shopping cart is kind of the definition of being neutered. And being treated like that by Vladimir Putin, it made me just wish for the day when Putin does the same thing to Trump, because that day probably will come. Putin knows he owns these people, and he acts accordingly. You know, Tucker's been all about the end of manhood, masculinity in crisis. Testicle tanning might be the answer to that. I'm worried. I think Tucker is in crisis, and he has been for some time.
And you're quoting sort of him in those suggestions and ads they have about the tanning.
Yes, he did. He did a whole feature on the beauties of testicle tanning, and I was paid to watch it, Ari, and not paid enough.
But as a journalist, yeah, you
got it.
You know,
sometimes.
Jay, there's things you cover in journalism. I want to bring it back a notch because with regard to the Daily Show,
right.
There's a history here. I want to show the original one when younger Jon Stewart confronted a very different Tucker Carlson, who was actually pitching a very different set of version of conservatism in a defenestration that many believe helped lead to the cancellation of that show. Take a look.
You have a responsibility to the public discourse, and you fail miserably
Is this really Jon
off
Stewart?
of their
What is this
marketing
anyway?
and strategy. Yeah, it's someone who watches your show and cannot take it anymore. How old are you?
35.
And you wear a bow tie.
Yeah, I do. I do.
So this is...
No, I know.
So this
You're
is
right.
theater.
No, let me just go. No, come on.
And
come on.
listen, I'm not suggesting that you're not a smart guy, because those are not easy to tie.
Jay, was Jon Stewart right about Tucker then? Is he right now? And does it matter if someone who is this prominent in the MAGA world, who was only ousted in connection with the costly defamation loss for Fox, and who recently interviewed Trump, does it matter if this person is a fraud? Should people care?
I think people definitely should care. And that scene you just showed is a crucial moment in the supervillain origin story of Tucker Carlson. Jon Stewart embarrassed and humiliated him. And why did he do so? Because Tucker Carlson at that time was a George W. Bush neocon, and that was what he was touting. Now he is a Donald Trump MAGA isolationist, pro-Putinist, very, very different orientation. And what Tucker learned from that humiliation is, I'm never really going to believe in anything again. I'm going to simply go where the winds blow me, and I'm going to go where the opportunities may take me. And that's exactly what has occurred, and that is why Tucker's a fraud. I mean,
And isn't it, I'm only jumping in to say that you're reminding everyone the conservatism and republicanism that Tucker was then affiliated with were against these kind of dictators abroad. And this is not flip-flopping on some random niche issue. This is not, the wokeism stuff goes back and forth, but some of it could be reduced to kind of localized rhetoric. And politicians in both parties have been known sometimes to tack back and forth. This is not that. They just oversaw the murder, the state assassination of a dissident. They just invaded a country for the largest land war in Europe. They're holding, as I mentioned, a Wall Street Journal reporter who many journalists have stood up for and said, that's wrong, the Biden administration's working on his release. I don't care the Wall Street Journal is owned by News Corp, which is owned by Fox, which has other people downplaying this. There's larger issues at stake. So when you look at that, what does it tell you that the Republican Party, part of it, I mentioned not some of the Senate, but part of it is taking cues from Tucker, who you say on the evidence doesn't stand for anything?
Yeah, I mean, Tucker Carlson, when Jon Stewart did that, humiliated him, was in favor of invading countries that had dictators like Vladimir Putin in charge. And now he goes to those countries and says everything is great and we should follow the lead of this. And the reason this has happened, if you noticed, is because as the majority of Americans oppose Trump, Republicans oppose democracy. And Tucker understood that, and he simply went where the dictators are.
Yes, that is, Joan gets the last word. Shay's reading on it is the darkest reading, probably the most disturbing reading, because you say, why does he need to go so far to justify this? And the worst possible answer, I want to be very careful. I can't say we can prove this yet. I can't say Tucker's admitted it. But the worst possible theory is to soften the ground for more of that stuff here at home in America.
Oh, absolutely. He's been sucking up to Orban. I mean, he sucks up to dictators now. That's his thing. The one thing I just always like to leave people on a positive note.
Sure, let's do it.
There's been some karma that's come for Tucker. He's no longer over on Fox News broadcasting to millions and millions of people. He's got these narrow channels. He does get attention when he interviews Putin, for better or worse. But in general, he's not quite the toxic person in our culture with the wide reach that he was.